Hello, my friends. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Christ and Coffee podcast, bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. Today, we have my good friend Kurt Heineman joining the program, sharing his journey from being a full-time minister to starting his own company, vision casting, financial planning. We're going to talk about money. We're going to talk about church-related things and trends and everything in between. Kurt, what's up, brother? It's good to see you, man. All the way from Spokane, Washington.
Yep, all the way from Spokane. Good to see you, Haig. Thanks for having me here today. And I'm just excited to talk to you. We've been friends for a long time, so I'm sure this will be a fruitful conversation about a variety of different topics today.
Yeah, so let me hear about your testimony. How did you we met in seminary, so how did you end up coming to seminary in the first place?
No, it's a good question. When I was in college at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington, I did some different college ministry internships, and I really loved those college ministry internships. And I thought maybe there was a sense of call for me to do full-time ordained ministry, but I had never worked in a church before. And so for the 2 years after college, I did some full-time ministry internships in a church setting. And that was when I discerned a call to ministry. And those churches were in Presbyterian churches in Seattle, Washington. And so while I was working there, that's when I had the sense of, I want to be a pastor, and I want to be a pastor in a Presbyterian church and seek ordination in my denomination, which is the PCUSA. And so, if you want to be a PCUSA pastor, there's a handful of seminaries that you'd like to go to. And usually the top on everyone's list is Princeton Theological Seminary. So that, of course, is where I ended up going. And that's where we met.
Yeah, man. And we were like friends right off the bat. It was cool to just, have the fellowship, hearing about your story. And you got to travel with a well-known minister during that internship, correct? He recently passed away. Earl Palmer was his name?
Yeah, so that year right before seminary, I worked for Earl Palmer. I was his study assistant. Earl was, he pastored a church in Manila in the Philippines for 6 years. And then he was the pastor of First Pres in Berkeley for 20 years. And then he was the senior pastor at University Presbyterian Church in Seattle for 20 years. So Earl had a really long, kind of incredible career in ministry. And then when he finished up at UPC, he started his own ministry called Earl Palmer Ministries that was just like John Stott Ministries. And he traveled and spoke and wrote books. And I was his first study assistant. So I traveled around the country with him on all of the speaking engagements. And we became great friends. And we became I loved working for him. And he was a good mentor to me. Earl just passed away about a month ago. And it's been a very emotional experience for me, actually, because he was one of those people that believed in me and mentored me. And losing him it felt like I was losing that mentor that believed in me. So it's been tough. I don't usually have that many emotional experiences when people die. Maybe that sounds weird to say that out loud, but it's been an emotional experience, actually. So yeah, Earl's been a huge part of my life. I think he was 93 when he died. And right up until the end, he was still writing and preaching, and he just finished his last book. I think he wrote more than 25 books in his life. So He's a prolific author too. Yeah.
That's amazing. And that's great that you had that spiritual mentor. And I think it's so important just to have someone who's already doing the work of the ministry to just believe in younger ministers, because no one starts off with being this amazing orator or preacher or minister. It's a very, just any field, having someone that believes in you and instills that confidence is so crucial for the journey for all of us. And I think it's part of the discipleship model of Jesus. It's pretty straightforward. Whoever is in front of you in certain career paths and in the things of Christian living, you need someone who's going to be giving life to you. And
Mm.
it's so beautiful to know that like we can't be a Christian apart from these mentorships. So then we met at Princeton Seminary, and then you became an ordained PCUSA, a minister. And then where did you end up doing ministry?
I was at a church outside of Seattle for a couple of years while my wife was in graduate school at the University of Washington. And then after that was done, my family and I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, and we lived on the peninsula. We lived in Redwood City, and then I was associate and then co-pastor of a church in a town called San Carlos, which is right in between San Francisco and San Jose. And I was there for almost 7 years.
Wow. And is that Silicon Valley area, or is it pretty
That
much?
is Silicon Valley. So where I lived in Redwood City, Facebook was like 3 or 4 miles away from my house. Google was close by in Mountain View, and then Apple's headquarters was just kind of down the road on Highway 101. So yeah, all the largest tech companies in the world were right next to where I used to live there.
What is it like doing ministry in that environment? I'm sure you're dealing with some really wealthy folks and some very tech-minded individuals. And
I think the challenge always was, and this seems so strange to say out loud to some folks, but one of the people in my church used to say that time is a more scarce commodity than money. And they were serious about it. You know, it was like, you could come by money, but you couldn't come by time. And so people were very deliberate about how they use their time. And, you know, that really meant that it was like when we were together in the room and there was people together, whatever they were working on for the church, it was like had to be really serious about it and steward that time well, because they only had so much of it, you know, and they could be with their families, they could be working. And when they're at the church, we had to really lean into that time and make sure we were stewarding it really well as the folks who were doing ministry there. But on the flip side, that was also hard because it meant that people would often say no to a lot of things and no to a lot of commitments. And it made sense, you know, they were busy. They had 50, 60-hour jobs that kept them busy, and they were running the world. So
yeah.
that was life. That was life in Silicon Valley.
Wow. I went to, I'm still struggling to find a barber out west, but I went to one of the barbers here. He had a crazy testimony. Like he was held at gunpoint and like bullets were fired and God protected him. And I asked, why did God protect you? He's like, because I have an army of people praying for my mom's church for me. Anyway, and I asked him this question because I'm teaching through the Lord's Prayer right now. And I said, well, right before I was going to teach on this topic, what does it mean when we ask God to give us this day our daily bread? And most people focus on provision and whatnot. He said the this day part, and he like kind of went into a sermonette about God give us this day. Every day is not given for taken for granted. So he was just focusing on the time piece of the provision. I thought that was fascinating that the emphasis was on the give us this day piece. In addition, because like the equation says, there's time and money, and both are sacred resources. And you found your way helping people now on the money piece. So what made you kind of pivot your career to talking about money, especially, you know, when people hear about a clergy person talking about money, it's usually red flags are popping up.
Yeah, or at least people were pretty anxious about it. Yeah, part of it was practical, and part of it was a sense of what I felt like was an intersection of the gifts and the skill sets that I have and the talent that I have. On the practical part, the reality is that my denomination, the PCUSA, is the numbers are diminishing pretty quickly. And the way that it works is that if you want to have a full-time call and you want to be in a particular location, the reality is that there are fewer and fewer opportunities all the time. And so if you want to live in a particular place, which I really wanted to live in a particular place years ago, which was here in Spokane, till it'd be close to family and friends, and this is where I wanted to have my kids grow up, that maybe I would have to wait like 10 years. So I didn't really want to wait 10 years to get a job opening and come here. So I decided from a practical perspective to change and build my own business and become a financial planner. So I own my own business and I'm loving it now. And then the other piece is that, you know, yes, pastors don't often talk about money, but part of the reality of being a pastor is that you're sort of like the director of development for a nonprofit, which is
Right.
the pastors are the one talking about money. We're the ones that are trying to help people align their lives with their values, and money is one practical application of our faith expression and our journey. So you do it all the time, Haig. I mean, all right, hopefully you invite people into a way of being that would be a healthy expression of generosity with their resources and their money. And so so that's what I do as a financial planner. I help people think about what's important to them, what are their values, what are their beliefs, and then I help them integrate that with their very practical behaviors in terms of helping them achieve their goals. So that's a little bit about the journey, brother.
Yeah, but you're not my only friend who kind of left the full-time ministry to pursue other careers. And I think when people think you're leaving the ministry, that means you're leaving the church or leaving your faith. But I'm finding that that's not the case for the vast majority of people who've left. You're still plugged into a church. You're still preaching late, like whenever there's opportunities. You're still heavily invested in ministry. It's just it now looks completely different.
It looks so different. I remember coming out of Princeton with you, the kind of dominant messaging that was coming around my denomination was for pastors to be preparing themselves for this reality of what they call tent making, which is that
Right.
you would have a job and then you would do ministry on the side. And I remember I resisted that. I thought, there's no way, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be like my mentor. I'm going to have this like illustrious, wonderful career as a pastor, but like life changes, and now I am sort of like doing this thing like tent making in a way where I have a job, I have a career, and I really enjoy doing what I do. But yeah, then on the side, you're right. Like I'm preaching, I'm serving on the board of trustees for my presbytery. So I'm giving back in that way with my time and my talents too. And the reality is the work that I'm doing is ministry. Like I'm ministering to people. I'm helping them. People are coming to me because they have some like desires and hopes and goals that they want to try to accomplish. And I get to use all the skill set that I've, curated over the years of being a pastor, listening to people well, reflecting back to them what their values are. And the fun part is I actually get to like do the concrete work of helping them. I laugh because like in ministry sometimes, like, people often say it's like planting a seed where you're like, you never know what's going to happen. Right.
Right.
And now
Right.
I'm like, no, I get to see what happens.
No,
I get to see the fruit grow on a tree,
the numbers don't lie at all, right? Like the financial numbers, when it comes down to people's patterns of living and priorities, I think you could look at it. Like, I mean, I could look at my bank account and see where I'm spending my money, and it's showing it's like revealing a large part of who I am in a very tangible, mathematical way. So it's really I love what you're saying, because you see what you're doing in your day job as a financial planner as ministry. And I think that's also part of like a very Protestant notion of the priesthood of believers, that there's ministry to be done in our day jobs. So it's not just the pastor on Sunday doing all the ministry stuff for the community. It's everyone engaging and seeing how they could be Christ-like in their respective careers. Do you find that? Sorry, you want to comment on that?
I was just I just wanted to add on to that. I was just thinking, when you said that, back when I was pastor and I was, doing that work, like what you said, I would say a lot to people, like, talk about the priesthood of all believers, like your work is a ministry in a way. And I would say it, but now that I'm on the other side, I really believe it. Like, and I believe it because I'm doing it. And it is really interesting. I know that's like the phrase that we kick around a lot about everybody has a ministry to do in some sense of calling or vocation. But now that I'm on the other side, it's like, no, I think everybody does have an opportunity to be doing ministry with their day-to-day work that they're doing. And it can give glory to God. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. I just, so I say that as encouragement to you so that when you encourage people, that they really are doing ministry. Because I think sometimes when we talk about ministry, we talk about it as like preaching on Sunday mornings and leading the board of elders and whatever else it looks like, right? So no, I think you're right.
Absolutely. I have a curious question. So are people more honest with you as a financial planner or a pastor?
financial planner. Uh, yeah, part of it is that like when we meet together, I just need to know everything there is about people so that I can help them. And so I say that, and the reality is it's like I know all of their accounts. I know what's happening with their money, all their different retirement accounts. I read through all of their insurance documents that they have. I read through their employee benefits handbook. So I just know a lot about my clients, but, and it's all held in confidentiality. And so I know a lot about my clients. I know a lot.
Yeah,
And there's
because
other intangible things that they tell me too that I know. Um,
how much of your work is non-math? Because I think when I hear financial planner, I'm thinking like you're just crunching numbers. But knowing from personal experience, and if everyone is honest, a lot of people's spending habits have nothing to do with math. Because I think if everyone was logical about their spending habits, there wouldn't be a crisis for many people when it comes to matters of money. Uh, do you feel like you're doing more like mathematical equations or more emotional counseling or when in your work?
oh man. Um, I think this is a really excellent question. And I think it gets to the kind of the heart of the matter, which is that, there are forces at work in the world that are trying to get us to live into certain kind of behaviors. And how do we like stop those behaviors from happening so that we can like live the life that we really want to live? Um, and so what I mean by that is that, to get to your question, is that I probably spent, it's probably like 50-50.
Okay.
There's like hard numbers, and I have a bunch of different tools as a financial planner about how I can help people make more money with the money that they do have. It just depends on like age. Like I have some clients who are in retirement, and it's like, all right, we have this certain kind of money that you have in a nest egg, and we need to manage it really well so that you can live for another 35 years, right? And so that's a ton of math. Um, but I also have some clients who are younger and they're trying to like get to that point in 20 or 30 years. And it's like, well, the reality is we need to set aside a bunch of money now leading up to that point so you can get to that point. But it's hard for some people to save money. You can make a ton of money, but it's hard to set aside money sometimes for people. And so, like, how do you have a mindset shift or a paradigm shift from spending to saving a good amount of money? Like, that's hard to do. So that part of it is more the behavioral, relational thing where, when I get to know people and we have a relationship together, then there's a space for me to play accountability where it's not like me. But the thing that I always try to do with my clients, with all of them, is I help each of my clients try to communicate what their values are, what's important to them, and then what their goals are. And so it's not me saying that they're doing something wrong. I'm just trying to say, here's what you said you were hoping that you wanted to accomplish. But if we continue down this road, you won't be able to accomplish this. Um, and so those can be hard conversations for people,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
helpful, but really helpful.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's I have a couple of friends who are like therapists uh and I've read this from other books on therapy related matters. So I think the therapists were pretty much saying when it comes to matters of money, people are very secretive. People are very they don't want to talk about it versus like everything else they could just be an open book about. There's always this shame connected to money and net worth, and I feel like it's really difficult to minister properly or to help people if there is this shame talking about numbers. I think there's that like famous there's like a Netflix series show my wife was watching the other day about couples and their inability to just talk about finances together. I know like finances is always a tension point in relationships. Um, like it's usually finances and in-laws usually are like the two big ticket items, but there's a lot of shame like connected to the psychology of just talking about money. Because every time I try to preach about money, it's like the principles. Okay, that's cool. Jesus said this. That's great. But there's always this like layer that needs to be pierced through to just talk like what would be perceived to be straightforward math.
Hmm. Yeah, no, you're totally right. It is hard to talk about money. I think it's really important to have pastors talk about money and for you to talk about it because, um, we don't want to be subservient to money. Like this is a tangent, but hey, we're on a podcast. I was just reading Jaber Crow by Wendell Berry. I don't know if you've ever read that book.
No.
No, it's a beautiful book. But at some part in the book, there's the part where he kind of talks about like the war and the economy, and he capitalizes them. And when I was reading that book, I kept thinking about like the powers and the principalities. Like for me, I don't often think of evil being personified, but it's in systems, and there's these systems that want us to sort of act in certain kind of ways in the world. And so it's not like, so I say all this to say that like the way that we act sometimes, I know we can feel shame and guilt about it, but also the reality is that like there's these systems that are trying to get us to behave in certain kinds of ways. And so
Yeah,
once
yeah.
we like become aware of it, then hopefully there can be some like liberation from it instead of just shame and guilt of my like individual actions. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, when Jesus says you can't worship God and money, the Greek is mammon. It's a god. There's a spiritual dynamic to that word money that the translators kind of stray away from. Absolutely. And then there's these systems
Mm.
of finding ourselves, and different cultures have more shame. And I think we don't realize how money driven America is as well. Because I think like New York City, where I did ministry for 10 years, like there literally is the raging bull. It's literally like a golden calf right in Wall Street. Like it's like there's a bronze calf in the middle. This is not like it's right there. Um,
Yeah.
but people will be like, no, it's just this intangible thing that we're just pursuing constantly after. And the Bible talks about the love of money is the root of all evil, and I think that also gets misquoted a lot. It's not money itself. Money is neutral, right? It's the love of money that leads to many times types of evil. In Timothy, it speaks about that. So it's a heart issue ultimately on how we relate to money. But if our heart is in the right place, then money becomes an important tool to support people, ministries, to it's a bedrock of how we interact day to day, and there's nothing evil about it. It's more of a neutral thing, but the heart connection to it, if it's connected to it's idolatry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's casting a positive vision for relationship with money is helpful sometimes compared to just the negative aspects of it, because I think for the vast majority of the folks that I interact with, money's a tool, and like I've already told you, like one of the things I say when I meet with people for the first time is like, I just ask them, what is important about money to you? And I kind of continue to ask that question and reflect it back to them, whatever their answers are. And it's really cool to see what answers people give. Like, most of the time, they understand that money's a tool, and it allows them to do certain kinds of things in the world that reflect their values, like giving to the church, giving to the local community. And they don't just say it, they actually do it, which is the coolest part to me. And then I get to play this kind of cool role of helping them optimize the way they live out those values, and especially when they want to be charitable. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, but what about like your typical like millennial showered with student debt and like unable to buy a house because like in the past you could be like could have like a simple job and be able to buy a house. Now it's like impossible for your typical younger person, and there's these dynamics of like shame on the millennial culture or younger generations expecting to hit certain landmarks where according to the math and inflation, it doesn't seem to add up. Can you speak into that? Because I think I think sometimes when we compare generations, especially, it could lead to different sorts of tensions in some of these topics of shame and expectations of where we should be at certain ages.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's just hard. I mean, the reality is that, like, for older generations, they got to buy a house for $50,000, $100,000. And even though if interest rates were pretty high back then, that was still pretty manageable given what they were making to be able to make payments on the house. And then eventually they were able to pay their house off, and then they'd have no debt at all. and that asset would grow like in
Right.
tremendous amount of value over time so that they could buy another house down the road. And they got to have assets. And so I think that's the real challenge for younger millennials is, is like, how can we change the balance sheet? And the balance sheet's a really simple equation. It's assets minus liabilities equals net worth, right? So we have to reduce the amount of liabilities in our life and increase the amount of assets. And so that's a real challenge because I think it was easier for older generations, potentially in some ways, to be able to have access to assets. And now, yeah, I mean, it's just hard. Like where you're living in LA, I'm sure the average price of a house in your neighborhood is like $1.5 million. Like, and I'm sure it's a 2-bed, 1-bath. It's probably something ridiculously silly like that. At least it was back in California. And so, or back when I was living in Silicon Valley, that seemed to be like the average house. So how does a young person with $150,000 income go about buying a house? Like, well, I don't know. It's hard. You got to start
And
saving
you're
money.
you're
Like,
assuming that that person's making that much, yeah. Or
I
yeah.
mean, but the reality is, like that's where like you gotta, the couples who do end up buying a house who are millennials, it's usually a couple working full time, and they're making way more than that. They're making $350,000-$400,000 a year. They probably work for a tech company where they get stock options, and that gives them an opportunity to have pretty like big bonus in a year or two, where then they can use that as a down payment to go buy a house. So that's the hard part for the millennials, man. I mean, making $150,000 on the West Coast of the United States of America, and you're starting out in certain parts of California, pretty tricky to buy a house. But then
Yeah,
again, if you're a millennial making $150,000 in the middle of the country, it's like, woo, I just
well,
buying my house with cash. So
exactly. Yeah, I remember when I left New York, the average rent was 5,000 just for like a studio, a bedroom apartment, like 5,000 a month for just a hole in the wall. And then I remember on the flight over as I'm moving my family, there was the most expensive cities to live in. New York City was number one. LA was number four. I'm like, yes, moving on up.
I mean, and it's just tough because like rent should be theoretically like 25 to 30% of your expenses. So, you got to be making a pretty healthy income if you're going to be spending $60,000 a year just on rent. It's like that's a lot to spend. So, and
Yeah,
that's a
and I
studio. What if you have a family, right? So
right, and
it's
I
hard.
think it's important to talk about this because like our generation and younger generations are we call like the Peter Pan generation because we delay rites of passages to to get married, to have kids, to have a home. And I know there's some people who just simply don't want to have kids, and then there's people who do, but they just can't afford it, so they freak out, and that's really detrimental because it's important to have kids for society to flourish and to excel and to grow, and we're already hinting at it through like the decline of the church. What does this mean to churches and church meetings and givings down the line if people are going to be swamped with debt and are unable to give to support ministry and nonprofits and any other good cause too? So there's all these dynamics that need to be talked about, and I think just having the conversation will do wonders versus just assumptions. And I know it's weird for pastors to talk about this because of the negative prosperity gospels out there. But most pastors are like overworked and underpaid, and they're keeping communities in check and supporting the local community. And I think that's the beauty of this country when we have these local communities just sharing love and being together. It's such an important, vital aspect of what it means to live here. So all these things need to be talked about, and I think you're right. Like I have to get comfortable talking about it. This is just me confessing. I don't like talking about it. I don't feel like I'm an expert, but at least I need to just talk about it because if I'm going to be effective as a minister, I need to talk about something that everyone cares about and needs to survive.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, churches can be very excellent partners with their local communities too, in identifying where the greatest need is and how to connect, churches to those greatest needs in terms of like human power and volunteering, but also like a conduit for financial resources too. But yeah, I encourage you to like have the conversations. Now that I'm a financial planner, there's a piece of me that like now I know everything that I know as a financial planner. There's a part of me that wishes like I could go back in time a bit and have some conversations with people that maybe I was too timid to have. But I
What would
mean,
be what would be advice you'd give to your younger self?
in that context,
And I
in
mean,
the
you're
ministry
dealing
context,
in general because you were dealing with Silicon Valley people.
yeah. So like I'll tell you about in the ministry context, and then I'll tell you personally. The ministry context would be there was people in my church who my perspective always was like, don't worry about what people do, just be in relationship with them and love them as individuals and as humans, right? And I think that's a really good perspective to have. Just don't even worry about the work that people do. Be curious about it, but don't make that sort of like the reason for which you might like entertain talking to them or praying for them or whatever. You know what I mean? But then later on, when I left, I was like, oh, there's this person I spent a lot of time with. And I did some Googling and I found out this person because when you have a company that that goes public, a lot of those shares and ownership values are public information. And then it had a certain valuation associated with it. And I was just blown away by how much this person was worth. And this person just came to church every Sunday. But I also knew that this person didn't give a lot of money to the church, basically like nothing. And so I just wished I would have talked to him about it. I wished I would have asked that question, like, how come you're not more generous? How come that? And really just
Yeah,
try to learn, like not.
I find that people who are making a good amount of money kind of want to do the Bill Gates approach to generosity. It's like, all right, when I retire, I'm going to donate a bunch of my cash to these organizations. But like that's not guaranteed. I feel like that misses the whole point of like what tithing is about. It's not supposed to be like I'm going to control this money that's mine to do whatever I want with it, and I'm going to just end well and by giving it away. What are you? That's a great point because I think there's this mindset of like missing the whole mark of why it's important for people to give weekly. So what are your thoughts on weekly giving? Like, what's the philosophy of it?
I mean, yeah, I think it's important to give like a percentage of your income to the church. And I think it's a really important thing. I think it's easy to say the word tithe, because that's the word that gets kicked around a lot. And it's the biblical word that we use. And it really just means like a tenth of the crops basically would go to the storehouse and it would support the work of the synagogue, right? And in our world, we use that analogy to refer to the money income that we have going to the church, 10%, a tithe. But the reality is that when you look at the research, there's only something like 5% of humans that actually do a tithe. It's not like everybody's doing it. Like I think that was the research I saw. Something like 5% of people actually do a tithe. So it's
Is
not
that
like
5% of Christians or 5% of the population?
5% of like church going folks do a
Okay,
tithe.
okay, yeah.
So, and the vast majority of folks are giving like less than $100 a year to the church. But then, so it's kind of like an upside down standard deviation bell curve where it's reverse, where it's like you have a ton of people to give very little, and then you have a few people to give a ton of money. So if you like look at it, that's kind of what it ends up being. And then there's some like folks kind of in the middle. So it's like an upside down bell curve. So I think it's really important practice. For me, if we go back to some of the earlier things we talked about in terms of the behavioral components and kind of the powers and the principalities, when I review my spending over the course of a month, I love to see giving in it, because what it does to me is instead of kind of having this like tight fist approach with money, it just kind of feels like it can be open-handed. It goes back to what you're talking about, love of money or love of Jesus. And doing it allows you just have an open-handed approach to life. And it makes you breathe a little bit easier. At least that's how it feels for me when I look at resources going that are charitable. It just makes me go, that's what I'm here for in life, and letting go of it, letting go of control, letting go of the need to do it. Still being responsible steward with your resources, but it just lets you be a little bit more open-handed and free, not so kind of tightly held on to I don't know. Does that make sense, Hyde?
Yeah, yeah. You were hinting at something you would say you tell to your younger self personally. You said about the
Oh.
professional piece of it. Do you remember? I just want to make sure you got that point across.
Oh, I thought you were asking me about like financial tips and what I would do
Oh,
financially.
okay, okay, okay.
Is
Got
that
it, got
what
it.
you're
Okay, just
asking
double
about?
checking. Yeah. Was that it? Just to.
Oh no, the thing I wished I would have done when I was younger was yeah, just like stuff money away in Roth IRAs, like through my 20s. Like I probably would have had opportunities to do that in times of my life to max out Roth IRA contributions. And I wished I would have done that. I didn't really get doing that until both my wife and I were working at the same time, and we were starting to put a lot of money away inside of retirement savings accounts in my 403b. So I got to it and I'm doing it, but the reality is that like compounding interest is a profound mathematical concept. If you want to go back to your question about math, and um, we want to take advantage of compounding interest, and so I probably missed out on maybe like 8 years of my life where I didn't
Yeah.
do that. So and that's when you can have the behavioral reality of regret. And anyways, so that's one of those things. If I went back in
Got it,
time,
got it. So invest in the math Roth IRA, and then the professional was to just nudge your church to use their resources and be more bold about it. Especially certain individuals that you were. These aren't just random people. These are people you're living life with.
yeah, exactly, it's like be
Yeah,
curious instead
yeah,
of if I was honest in my ministry perspective, I think I would say I was avoidant. I didn't necessarily want to talk about it, but I knew something was there, and so I wished I would have just been more curious about what was going on in people's lives in terms with money. But I felt scared to talk about it, so
right, right.
um,
Expect
I
it's
wished I would
but
be less scared. Just
be,
curious.
because your livelihood is dependent on the givers. So there's always this weird dynamic with pastors talking about it. But I think you're right. Like you said, if Jesus talks about it and it's in scriptures, we got to talk about it. And you were saying earlier that when you give, you feel like your heart is open, your hands are open to feel less attached to this thing that is a necessity, but it could become a, a root of many types of evils if we're too attached to it. And it's not like God needs our money. Like it just we're proper stewards of of the resources he gives.
Yeah,
But
exactly, because it's
and
not
I do
like our money; it's God's money, right?
right.
And it's God's resources that we get to manage and take care of. But I think you're right. I just to like circle back on that idea that you were just talking about. Um, yeah, actually, I just lost my train of thought. So you go next. I go.
Sure, sure. No worries. I'm kind of all over the place. Too caffeinated up right now. But yeah, I think I do find that the church shoots itself in the foot because we look to televangelism, and luckily with like stuff like this podcast and online ministries, you don't have to like raise a certain amount of money to have TV rights, and the types of TV uh, people that get the ratings and the income for the television channels tend to be heavily leaning towards prosperity gospel, where it's this notion that if you give money to this ministry, you're going to be blessed a thousandfold. And prosperity gospel is pretty much evil. Like, if you look at the temptations that Jesus faced in the wilderness, it sounds like prosperity gospel. like you're gonna have all this bread if you just say so. If you're gonna be ruler of the world if you just say so. And oftentimes there's this false gospel being the worst case. So sometimes the when people hear churches talking about money, they're thinking, I don't know, the indulgences in the Catholic Church during the Martin Luther's era, or the ridiculousness that's on TV, where you're going to support a pastor buying a private jet. So I think it's important for people not to just buy into the extreme scenarios and just talk more about the normative relationships with income and tithing and giving and offertory. But I find that like just starting with a percentage is better than jumping to 10 right away, especially if most people don't do it. And just building the confidence to kind of just trust God with the money more and more and just be obedient to what he wants. Because there's different philosophies. Some people don't think that the 10% thing applies to the New Testament. It could be more, it could be less, depending on what people say. Other people are dogmatic about it. That's the the place to start.
Yeah. I remember what I was going to say, which is related to this conversation, is that like in my work now, I am a fiduciary, which means that I take on this legal obligation to always act in my client's best interest all the time. And it's like right there in the contract, I am your fiduciary. So I don't sell any products. I don't make any commissions off of any of the work that I do for folks. Like, it's all about their best interest. And the reality is that when you're a pastor, you're not always a fiduciary for people in your church. You like wrestle with that all the time, because I remember there was probably some folks in my church who, the more that I got to know them, I'd be like, you're probably a better fit at the church next door. But at the church next door, it's like, but we need people in our ministries, And so I think those are like real dynamics that are at work that are hard when you're a pastor of a church. So, yeah, absolutely. That's the
Yeah.
hard work. I think if you're aware of it and you talk about it and you communicate about it, then I think that kind of goes a long way to being transparent with folks in the church. And I think that's helpful.
So I've noticed this trend. You're not my only friend who's kind of left the full-time ministry. What do you think is going on? Is it because they can't live in certain locations? Is the job market not good for pastors? Or what do we think is going on with the lack of clergy and then even those who've gone through the process of ordination stepping aside?
I think a few things. One would be that the church is changing. The church that maybe we grew up in, it kind of came out of 1950s, 1960s, and you could be a professional pastor, in one of these church environments, and you could support a family on that kind of an income. And that's changed a lot. There's a lot less security in the idea of being a full-time pastor and having a profession out of this thing. And so I think that's one change that's making it more difficult now. I think some of the other realities is that, ministry for an 8-year period there was really, really hard. Like, the last 8 years of ministry was incredibly challenging. When the pandemic started, that was so hard for pastors. And I think one of the realities that's always been there has been having like good mental health as a pastor has always been a struggle. But then you layer it on with the way the world has been for the last 5 years, has been incredibly challenging. And so I think it's like, when people look at it, do they think, hey, I'm going to do this career that I feel called to? But what it means is that my family is going to be worse off from an energy and a mental health perspective for me and our family. Or maybe I can go do something else that's way less stressful. And I can end up kind of providing and taking care of my family doing the work that I'm doing. So I think those are some of the big factors in it. And I wonder like what the next 10 years is going to look like. But at the end of the day, maybe what it's going to look like is going to be more biblical, in a sense, which is that like people had jobs. There weren't a lot of professional pastors in the first century, I mean, there were some, but, maybe that's what it's going to look like.
And people meeting in homes versus buildings, and then like all the bells and whistles now required for and most churches are small churches, and you still have to put the output of a bigger church with less staff oftentimes. And what does that look like sustainably as a sustainable model moving forward? Yeah, maybe you're right. It's going to be more a biblical approach where it's not going to be these full-time ministers, but more church tent makers.
I mean, I think you're totally right. It's like, I know a lot of churches who when they look at their balance sheet, when they look at their books, they're like, well, we have enough money for the next 2 years. Like, imagine being the lead person in an organization that has this anxiety and stress out in front of them. That's basically like, we only have 2 years left. And then they inevitably they get enough money to keep going for another year, enough money to go for another year. But that sort of insecurity doesn't allow for an expansive sort of imagination and a healthy imagination for what you might want to do 5 years out or 10 years out, right? When you're only worried about like the next 2 years, that's an incredible amount of stress and worry and anxiety, and pastors shoulder it all, and then it trickles down to their families. And so I think that's a big part of it, is the mental health capacity. It's hard. Pastors,
Yeah.
they have a hard job.
Yeah, but it's a calling and it's a joyful job too. You get to minister to people. I love doing it. It's such a joy for me to to preach and to mentor and to counsel. But there are these realities as the church is declining, as old institutions are trying to keep afloat. And there's this wave of decline, and the ramifications of that wave got accelerated by the pandemic. And it's only gonna like it's gonna be sad seeing churches closing down more so than we think. And I'm sure you're noticing it with some of the counseling you're doing. Um, so
Totally.
yeah,
I would say, Hygo, since you and I are friends, that's really true. You do love ministry. Like, there's not a lot of other people I know in the world that like genuinely love it, and it's a part of who they are, and it's like this calling in their life. I mean, I think that was one of the things that attracted me to you and us being friends, was that it felt natural to you. It's like it was just who you are, and you love it. You have a joy for ministry, and it's a really wonderful thing. You are not a cynical person, my friend. So, like, there may be some other folks in the world who are cynical that try to drag you down, but you're just a really joyful person, my friend. And you
yeah.
love the work you've been called to,
It's so funny because people who don't know me well think the opposite, but those who know me well just confirm what you said. Because I think I have that resting curse word face where I'm just always stoic and just looking like straight. But yeah, I'm constantly cracking jokes and stuff because I think when at the end of the day, God's in control. There's the fruit of the Holy Spirit. There's peace, love, joy. What is there to worry about? We can cast our anxieties onto the Lord. Even worst case scenarios, we worship a God who redeems this world ultimately, and praise God for that.
Well, I'm
Kurt,
thankful for your ministry in LA, man. I'm thankful for what you're doing. I'm thankful for your ministry on this podcast. And I'm thankful for you, my friend.
likewise, brother. It's always good to catch up and have these conversations. And thank you for sharing your story and your journey so far, and vision casting, financial planning, and this conversation talking about something that we are trying to break the stigma of, and just talk about it. So thank you, Kurt. Thank
Yeah,
you all.
man. Thank you, Hag.
Thank you, everyone, for watching this episode of the Christ and Coffee podcast. Thank you, Kurt, for your time, and thank you for listening. Please tune in next Wednesday for a brand new episode of the Christ and Coffee podcast. God bless you.